Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris Italiam, fato profugus lavinaque venit litora. Multilet terris iactatus et alto, vi superum, saevae memorem unonis ob iram. Multa quoquet bello passus dum conderet urbem inferretque Deos latio, genus unde Latinum, Albanique patres ad qualtae moenia Romae. Musa, mihi causas memora, quo numine laeso, quidve dolens regina Deum, tot volvere casus, insignem pietate virum, tot adire labores impulerit. Tantae nanimis cae lestibus irae?
I sing of arms and of a man displaced by fate, the first to leave the coast of Troy for Italy and its Lavinian shores. The power of the gods and vicious wrath of unforgetting Juno hurled him far across the sea and lands, and he endured still further pain in war, the price to found his city and install his gods in Latium. The Latin race, the Alban lords, the walls of soaring Rome, from here they all began. Muse, tell me why it happened. What offense, what painful insult led the Queen of Heaven to drive a man renowned for faithfulness through such ordeals, such endless miseries? Do gods have so much anger in their hearts?
So thank you both so much for giving us a little taster of your amazing translation, on which I want to just congratulate you. This is it's a monumental achievement. It's a wonderful translation of a wonderful poem. We'll read a little bit more, but before we do that, I'd like to just ask you to tell us a little bit about epic as a genre and contextualize a little bit the plot of the Aeneid.
Sure, yes. So first of all, thank you to the 92nd Street Y for hosting us, and thank you all for coming out tonight. So the Aeneid is, yes, an epic poem written, as you heard, originally in Latin. It was finished in 19 BCE under the first Roman Emperor Augustus. By epic, I think we mean first, it's a very long poem, very substantial poem, and it's a poem on a weighty, kind of serious, culturally significant topic. Virgil takes a character who's a pretty minor character in the Iliad, Aeneas, and following Greek and Roman precedent, he turns him into the foremost ancestor of the Roman people. To summarize this poem in roughly 2 minutes or less is a tall order. So I think Susannah is perhaps the person to
I'll do what I can.
Okay.
No promises on the 2 minutes, but I'll try. Yes, so the Reader's Digest version of the Aeneid, right, so that the man displaced that you heard mentioned in the opening line of the translation is indeed Aeneas himself, and he's been displaced because he has been forced to flee his homeland, Troy, after it's been destroyed by the Greeks at the end of the Trojan War. So Aeneas and a small band of followers, including his father and his son, make their way across the Mediterranean. They're told that they have kind of a destined home to seek across the sea. We, as readers, kind of figure out somewhat before they do that destined home is Italy. But along the way, they're harassed repeatedly by their chief divine antagonist, Juno. So she's the divinity whose wrath is really at the center of those opening lines that you heard. So that destiny doesn't come easily. She sets numerous obstacles in their path, among them a tragic love affair, a journey into the underworld, and also devastating war that arises when they ultimately arrive in Italy. So you might think that the arrival in Italy, that once we get there, that we're nearing the end. In fact, there's a whole second half of the poem after that. And many things that we could mention there, but I think in lieu of describing in detail the conflict that arises in Italy, maybe I'll go ahead and spoil the end, because I think the Aeneid has been out for long enough now at this point, that at least is safe. So the poem ends with Aeneas standing over his chief rival in Italy, the warrior Turnus. Aeneas has emerged seemingly triumphant in the war that he's faced with the local population, the Latins. But in the final moments of the poem, we find a really unsettling version of Aeneas who's kind of overwhelmed completely by fury, and he's presented with a choice, whether he'll show mercy to his defeated enemy or not. we as readers, in some respects, kind of expect him to show mercy, but that's not what he does. So Virgil gives us instead a jarring ending to the poem in which we see Aeneas, again, swept away by wrath, plunging his sword into his defeated enemy, and we leave it there. We get no further closure beyond that. So I think we'll leave it there as well for the summary, but there's certainly more that we could say about the end as our conversation unfolds.
So we're going to read a little bit of a longer passage. I'm picking up on the tragic love affair. Many readers of the Aeneid thought that Dido was the best character, so we're going to read a little bit from the Dido episode in Book 4, in which Dido and Aeneas are having a angry discussion. Do we need to do more setup? No, we don't.
Yeah.
We're good, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Go for it.
And yet the queen, for who can fool a lover, sensed from the start the plot that was in motion. Even when all was safe, she lived in fear. Unholy rumor stoked her rage with news of readied ships and voyages prepared. Incensed, she raved and dashed throughout the city, just like a Thuiad when the emblems shake, when the biennial rites and Bacchic cries and Mount Kithaeron loudly call at night. At last, she pressed Aeneas on his plans, confronting him before he could begin.
Did you imagine you could hide this outrage? You traitor! And depart without a word? Can nothing make you stay here? Not our love, our vows, the bitter death that waits for Dido? Why work to get your ships prepared in winter and race to sail the deep on northern winds? How heartless, if you did not seek strange lands and unknown homes, and ancient Troy still stood. Would you set out for Troy on stormy seas? Or do you run from me? But by these tears, and by the hand that you have pledged to me, for I have nothing else in my despair, by our new marriage, by the vows we made, if helping you has earned me any kindness, if life with me was sweet in any way, pity a falling house and change your plan. I pray, if it is not too late for prayers. Because of you, the Libyan tribes and tyrants who rule Numidia are filled with hate. My Tyrians have turned on me in anger. Because of you, my honor has been lost, and the good name I had before we met, the one path I was taking to the stars. My guest, all I have left to call a husband, to whom do you abandon me to die? Why should I linger here? Until my brother Pygmalion demolishes my walls? Until Iarbas leads me off in chains? If only you had given me a child before you ran. If only a small boy, a young Aeneas, played inside my halls, whose face would bring you back when you were gone. I would not feel so shattered and alone.
With this she stopped. Recalling Jove's commands, he kept a steady gaze and struggled hard to curb the anguish deep inside his heart. At last, he gave this brief response.
My queen, I never would deny that you deserve whatever you could want from me and more. And I will not regret recalling Dido, not while I still remember who I am, nor while the breath of life still fills my body. But let me briefly speak in my defense. I did not hope to slip away unseen. Do not imagine that. Nor did I raise a marriage torch and enter such a union. If fate had left me free to live my days and lay my cares to rest as I would want, before all else, I would look after Troy and the dear remnants of my countrymen. The lofty house of Priam would remain. I would have built High Pergamum once more and brought it back to life for the defeated. And yet Apollo, the Granean god, has told me through his Lycian oracle to rush to Italy, great Italy. That is my love. That is my country now. If watching Carthage rise in Libya can keep you here, Phoenician that you are, then why be angry when the Teucrians decide to settle in Ausonia? We too are right to seek a foreign realm. Each night, when misty darkness hides the world and stars blaze overhead, my troubled father visits me in a dream. Anchises' ghost comes with a warning, filling me with fear. So too the thought of dear Ascanius shows me how wrong it is to cheat my son of his Italian realm and fated fields. Jove's messenger, I swear, by both our lives, just brought the gods' commands on urgent winds. My own eyes saw him entering the city in broad daylight. My ears drank in his words. Stop making this more painful for us both with your complaints. I sail for Italy against my will.
But all this time she glared at him in silence out of the corner of her roaming eyes and stared him up and down. Her rage then broke.
No goddess was your mother. No, you traitor! Your line did not begin with Dardanus. The jagged Caucasus gave birth to you. Hyrcanian tigers nursed you with their milk. For why pretend? So I can suffer more? I wept, and did he sigh or look my way? Succumb to tears? Feel pity for my love? Where to begin when neither mighty Juno nor the Saturnian father looks with justice on these events? No oath is ever safe. I took him in, a needy castaway. Fool that I was, I let him share my kingdom. I saved his scattered ships, his men from death. It makes me burn with fury. Now Apollo has spoken, and now the Lycian oracles, and now Jove's messenger is sent from heaven to bring his fearsome orders on the winds. Yes, this is what concerns the gods above. This troubles their serenity. But go. I will not hold you back, nor prove you wrong. Follow the winds and sail for Italy. Head for your kingdom far across the waves. Still, if the righteous gods have any power, I hope you drown in vengeance on a reef, while often calling out the name of Dido. My torches, black with smoke, will follow you when cold death draws the spirit from my flesh. My ghost will haunt you everywhere you go. You are despicable, and you will pay, and I will hear of it among the shades.
The anguished queen broke off and tore herself away from sight. She left him faltering, in deep distress and hoping to say more. When she collapsed, slaves came and carried her back to her marble rooms and laid her down. Faithful Aeneas longed to soothe her grief, to talk and ease her pain. His sighs kept coming. Great love shook his resolve. But even so, he kept the gods' commands and sought his fleet. The Trojans worked to draw their tall ships down to fill the shore, then launch their well-oiled hulls. They grabbed raw, leafy wood to serve as oars in their desire to go. You could have seen them rushing from all corners like ants preparing for the winter months and raiding piles of wheat to fill their stores. Their long black ranks move through the grassy field and haul their plunder on a narrow track. Some bend their backs to heave the giant grains, while others drive the line and keep it moving. The whole trail teems with their activity. But how you suffered, Dido, as you watched. How painfully you moaned as you looked down from your high tower at the seething shore and saw the water churn with all the action. What will you not drive human hearts to do, relentless love? You make her weep again, and beg and bend her pride to love again, anything to avoid a needless death.
So then, now we're going to have just a tiny bit from book 6, which is after Dido has experienced her needless death, and Virgil has traveled. Aeneas has traveled to the underworld to visit his father and encounters the shade of Dido there.
In this deep wood, Phoenician Dido roamed, her wound still recent. When the Trojan hero came close and recognized her misty shape among the shadows, as a person sees or thinks he sees a new moon through the clouds, he wept and spoke to her with tender love.
So, devastated Dido, was it true that you took up a sword and chose to die? Was I the one who made you end your life? I promise, by the stars and gods above, by anything held sacred in these depths, unwillingly, my queen, I left your shores. The gods' commands that drive me through these shades, through desolate decay and endless night, these made me go. I never could have thought that leaving you would lead to so much pain. Please, stop. Please, do not vanish from my sight. Why run from me? This is the final word that fate will ever let me say to you.
With these appeals, Aeneas tried to soothe the fiery anger of the glaring queen. His eyes were full of tears. She turned aside and kept her gaze fixed firmly on the ground, showing no more emotion on her face as he began to plead than would a block of solid granite or Marpesian marble. At last she tore herself away in hatred and hurried back into the shady grove. Zacchaeus, whom she married long ago, was there to comfort her and share her love. Aeneas trailed behind her from afar, shaken by the injustice of her death, and wept in pity as she disappeared.
So as you can hear, it's a marvelous translation, which is both beautifully lyrical in those wonderful similes and also really vivid in the dialogue passages and evoking all these emotions. And I thought maybe we should start by just talking about this combination of the emotions of Dido and then all these other highly emotional characters that Aeneas encounters, and then Aeneas himself constantly standing stock still like a block of marble. What is Virgil doing with this protagonist who many readers have thought of as, why is he so nebbishy? Why doesn't he do anything? Why do you pick this weird virtue of pietas, which you translate as both dutifulness, piety, faithfulness? This is a weird characteristic for an epic hero. And so I think the way that readers very often sympathize with Dido more than Aeneas. Aren't we supposed to be rooting for the hero? What's up with all of that? So there's some thoughts about those set of topics.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for raising that constellation of questions. I would say it is a surprise, this epic hero that we get in Aeneas. So the virtue that you mentioned of pietas, that is a sort of quintessentially Roman virtue that amounts to a kind of duty in various different directions. So it's a dutifulness toward, say, the gods. This is the sense in which we get the English derivative piety, but also toward your obligations to your family. If you're a leader, your obligations to those under your command and care, your obligations to the state, and so on. This is not, right off the bat, maybe something that sounds like an absolutely thrilling, heroic virtue, right? It doesn't necessarily have the glamour of kind of the martial prowess of Achilles or the kind of devastating cleverness of Odysseus. It's really the virtue of a hero who will be asked to give up everything in service of the obligations that he faces. So I think a big part actually of the apparent sort of emotionlessness of Aeneas in many of these moments is actually a way of underscoring exactly how fully he embodies this virtue of pietas. It's complicated. It's not always the case that he sort of lives entirely into that, but he's trying to. So when he, in one of his first appearances in the poem, he shows up and says, "Hello, I'm Pios Aeneas." That's the adjective form of pietas. This is who I am. So because of kind of how much he's trying to embody that virtue, he relates to the emotions and the experiences of other characters in ways that often make him kind of perhaps incomprehensible or not totally sympathetic. And in contrast, of course, someone like Dido, she gets all the best lines in Aeneid 4. She's, her emotion, her devastation when Aeneas leaves, proceeds to leave to follow his destiny. It's felt in many ways kind of more strongly, and I think Virgil is deeply interested in showing us that shadow side, the cost of living into this virtue.
I'll just say very quickly, you wouldn't cast a young Brad Pitt to play Aeneas as you did Achilles in the movie Troy from the late 90s, right? He just isn't that kind of glamorous hero, isn't that kind of almost sexy hero, right? And this is because, again, this this suppression of the self and the suppression of private desires. These are things that really define this particular Roman version of the epic hero. It's a more kind of weathered, a more somber, a more kind of minor key heroism. So again, it's striking. It's a striking change from the Homeric backdrop, but it's very much in tune with more Roman virtues, and especially the Roman virtue of pietas.
So maybe pivoting a little bit, but do you think a translator has to have the virtue of pietas? Is it about
I certainly hope not.
Dutiful responsibility and suppression of the self in the spirit of another voice, right? I mean, you have to be channeling something that's not yourself and going for this larger goal. Obviously, in your case, it's not founding an empire that will destroy many other cultures, but instead it's creating something. So I guess I'm wondering, do you have to balance passion with pietas in this project, as well as balancing the various roles that you two both brought to this project?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, you need to kind of suppress the self a bit to honor the voice of Virgil and voice of the author whom you're translating. I think one of the ways, we really tried to create for ourselves a kind of sympathy with him and try to bridge this incredibly long chronological gap and the cultural gap as well. One of the ways we tried to do this is through formal means. So you might have heard a bit of this. We translated this poem into iambic pentameter, into blank verse, so unrhymed iambic pentameter. So we tried to give ourselves a real kind of metrical structure and kind of metrical rules to abide by, and this kind of reflects Virgil's own practice. Virgil wrote in dactylic hexameter, a particular metrical pattern. So the idea is to give ourselves formal constraints that Virgil also faced. Also, when it came to the content, I mean, what defines this poem, I think, primarily is this undercurrent, or sometimes even kind of pervasive spirit of grief and sadness and difficulty and despair. And we really wanted to convey that sense of emotion in this poem. And that, I think, required a certain amount of restraint. Virgil's in many ways a kind of reticent, restrained poet. So we had to kind of feel that as well with him and try to kind of enter into that kind of mood with him.
So you were with him, but you were also with each other. So I'm wondering if you can comment on just the process of creating a translation by two different people.
Yes, definitely. So there was, I would say, another kind of pietas, actually, that comes into, sort of committing oneself and subordinating oneself to, being a collaborator and working toward this larger vision. In terms of our process, it actually sort of changed as the project developed. So when we first kind of started tentatively typing out some lines of the translation in 2018, Emily, I think you were one of the first readers actually who saw those, which fortunately, they were significantly revised. Yeah. We thank you for not shutting us down, altogether at that point.
I could see the germ or something.
Yeah. But so when we first started into this project, we really were proceeding in a mode of kind of alternating, each one of us drafting a book, so 12 books of the Aeneid. We were kind of dividing and conquering, in a sense, and then swapping drafts, seeing how far we could push the track changes functionality on our word processors before it completely gave up on us. But at a certain point, once we had kind of drafted the entire poem in that mode, we realized that you can't really create a kind of cohesive poetic voice in that way. So at that point, in, I would say, I guess the fall of 2022, we entered into the process that really carried us the rest of the way from there, which was sitting down in real time, line by line, beat by beat, and translating every piece of the poem together. So sometimes that took place in person, sometimes it took place by video call, but I think that was where we really felt that a kind of cohesive voice could emerge for us, and certainly required us at times. There might be suggestions that you personally are, I think maybe that's a good idea, that kind of hit your collaborator the other way, and that we kind of learned each other's tells, and but I think that was in many ways just getting to kind of live with this poem and with each other as we worked through it in that way was such a just such a gift, even as much discipline as it also required us to exercise.
So it strikes me that the process of there being multiple voices that are then made into a single voice is also analogous to part of what Virgil is doing in the Aeneid. People sometimes say, oh, this is just fan fiction because it's derivative. We may have a prejudice against derivative literature. Part of what this poem does so brilliantly is to be constantly alluding to earlier literature, especially the Homeric poems, and making meaning out of these earlier poetic and literary voices, and not doing it in a way that it's sort of unconscious and he hasn't thought through why are we weaving all this different stuff from the earlier tradition together, but creating a new coherent thing where you're supposed to be constantly picking up, oh yes, but there's this debate between, is Aeneas going to be Hector? Is he going to be Paris? Is he going to be Achilles? Is he going to be Odysseus? What does it mean to have an Odyssean journey where the homeland is somewhere he hasn't been before? So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about how Virgil is weaving together multiple different earlier poetic voices and making something new and coherent out of those.
Yeah, sure. So the Aeneid is entirely in conversation with Homer and with both the Iliad and the Odyssey. He advertises this in the very first two words of the poem, Arma and Virum. Arma corresponds to Manin, the first word of the Iliad, meaning wrath. Arma means arms, so the same kind of sense of violence and especially military violence. The second word of the Aeneid is Virum, meaning man. The first word of the Odyssey is Andra, meaning man. Right, so those very first two words makes you aware that, oh yes, this poem is going to combine the Iliad and the Odyssey. It took 48 books for Homer. Aeneid gets the job done in 12, so pretty impressive active compression here, right? And then throughout the poem, the first half of the poem is often seen as the Odyssean half of the poem, corresponding more to Homer's Odyssey. The second half of the poem is seen more as the Iliadic half, more with martial content and battles and things of that sort. But it's never a stale rehashing of Homer. It's always in kind of creative dialogue with Homer. As Emily said, at certain points, Aeneas looks like Odysseus, and then he doesn't. And then he looks like Achilles, and then he doesn't. And then he looks like Hector, and then he looks like even Paris. So there's this constant kind of back and forth with that poem, and a kind of constant kind of challenge to his reader, almost to keep up with him in the kind of elusive energy of this poem, the kind of, again, creative engagement with the greatest kind of epic poem of the Greco-Roman tradition before him.
Yeah, I'll add maybe just a couple of quick examples of those strategies that we see in the Aeneid. One pertaining to the Odyssey. So if we have, I assume we have some Odyssey fans in our midst. Surely you might think, among the most famous episodes of the Odyssey, of the Cyclops. Well, Virgil can't resist the temptation of including a sort of Cyclops episode of his own in the Aeneid. So in Aeneid 3, as Aeneas and his followers are kind of making their way in their journey across the Mediterranean, they're very much traveling in the wake of Odysseus. So there's this kind of collapsing of literary time as well, because the Homeric poems were written significantly before Virgil. But as far as Virgil's concerned, Aeneas is kind of right behind Odysseus. He's very much in his tracks. So conveniently, Virgil actually invents a survivor of the Cyclops episode who's been abandoned by Odysseus. He's been left behind on the island to sort of eke out a pitiful existence. And Aeneas and his men meet this guy, Achaemenides, and he actually tells them, well, I was a member of Odysseus's crew, and this is what happened to me. So he tells them the story of the Cyclops, this invented character. And so on the one hand, we get a glimpse into the world of the Odyssey. We get to kind of immerse ourselves in one of its most famous adventures. But we're also doing that in a way that makes us look a little bit askance at Odysseus because he's abandoned a member of his crew. This poor guy has been left behind eating shrubs and berries, and so on and so forth. So we get this sense that Odysseus, unlike Aeneas, kind of didn't exercise the kind of dutifulness to his crew that we see Aeneas exercising. And just to say very quickly, we also see a sort of similar phenomenon relative to Achilles in the final lines of the poem when Aeneas makes his decision not to show mercy to his defeated enemy, because the Iliad ends with Achilles having made the decision to show mercy to his own enemy, the Trojan king Priam, by giving back the body of his son Hector. So we sort of expect, in fact, that maybe Aeneas will one-up Achilles by showing even more mercy, and in fact he does exactly the opposite. So again, not a stale rehashing, very much kind of in creative dialogue and transforming these moments.
Right, I mean, so just sort of picking up on that reading of the ending, because of course it's in dialogue with the end of the Odyssey as well, right? And of course Odysseus at the end of the Odyssey is on a killing spree, right? And he's only restrained by the presence of Athena. Aeneas doesn't have the blessing of Athena, and instead he has his kind of creepy mother, who's the mother of the Roman people as well as the goddess of sex. But she doesn't seem to be looking out for him in quite the same way that Athena is looking out for Odysseus. So I think there are ways that the whole divine apparatus of the Aeneid is both constantly looking back to Homer and also very different. And it also seems to me really interesting that, you know, in book 6, when Aeneas has his encounter with his father, and he's taught about the values of future Rome, those values include the idea that you must make war to the bitter end on the proud, but you must also show mercy to the defeated. And so there's this real ambiguity about, isn't Turnus the defeated when he's right there on the ground? Maybe not. Maybe he's still the proud. So there's sort of ambiguity about what are Roman values. And so I'm wondering if we could maybe sort of use that as a springboard to talk a bit more about the representation of Rome in this poem. I mean, I think one of the other big struggles that people sometimes have with it is Homer doesn't sort of lead you up to a particular moment in history and doesn't say, oh, this was all leading up to the golden age of Athens, or then that led up to making Ithaca great again, because Ithaca was never great, it was always a backwater. And that's kind of the point, right? It's the middle of nowhere, or it's the far edge of nowhere. It's not even the middle of anywhere. Whereas Rome is presented in this poem as absolutely the middle and the culminating point of history. And yet we also never get there. And so I think there's something so fascinating about how, as Susannah says, we end in this sort of moral quandary where Aeneas seems to go with lack of mercy, and that's surprising in a whole lot of ways. And also, if we've been expecting this to be a poem about the foundation of Rome, Aeneas isn't even the founder of Rome. He's the founder of this other place that will then eventually, through various other permutations, lead to people being born who will be able to found Rome. So what is Virgil doing with history in this poem? There are many possible answers to that. Tell us some of them.
Yes, I mean, I think there, too, he's dealing in historical ambiguity and moral ambiguity. I mean, this whole poem abides in the space of ambiguity, which, again, it can seem odd, given that this is ostensibly a national epic, an epic about the foundation of Rome, the kind of faded, at the time, the favored, kind of most favored nation status in the world. There are moments in the poem, books 1, book 6, as Emily just mentioned, book 8, where explicitly Rome is brought into this earlier epic world. There are kind of flash forwards to Roman history, and especially to the figure of Augustus. So again, who's the emperor when Virgil is writing the Aeneid. In an earlier poem, the Georgics, book 3 of the Georgics, Virgil had promised Augustus a grand epic kind of celebrating Augustus's deeds, this great kind of celebratory, we might say propagandistic epic. So that might be what Augustus anticipated. It might be even what if we've read the Georgics, will anticipate entering the Aeneid. It's not at all what we get, right? We get something very, very different. Again, something that kind of, on the one hand, does point forward to Rome, and again, point forward to Rome's faded place in history. But on the other hand, one that really calls attention to the cost of the founding of that Roman Empire, the cost both to those who oppose the empire, but even to Aeneas himself, right? The self-sacrifice, the suppression of the self, the succumbing to violence, right? These things. So we have to ask ourselves, why did Virgil do this, right? And the answer is we don't know, right? And we kind of can't know. One possibility is he was a great kind of heroic artist who, in the face of growing autocracy, kind of took a stand, right? And through art, the only means he had available, kind of voiced his protest, right? And that is possible. Another possibility is that Augustus wasn't quite as autocratic as we might think he was, and especially in the early part of his reign, allowed more for free expression and the kind of freedom of the artist, right? So that's possible too. We can't know, but it raises incredibly interesting questions. And that's something that this poem just does. It does not provide easy answers, but raises really provocative questions.
I'll add maybe just
yes.
a small point, which is that I think also for us as readers of the Aeneid, we're constantly confronted with these moments where the people who oppose the Romans are actually in many ways kind of more compelling. When I say the Romans, I mean, in fact, the Trojans, the kind of proto-Roman side that Aeneas represents. But so we have characters like Dido, as we've spoken about. We also see, in later parts of the poem, characters who maybe initially don't look very sympathetic, but undergo these kind of curious transformations into sympathetic figures. So one could suggest that Turnus is one of those. When we see him on the battlefield in kind of earlier scenes in that Italian warfare sequence, he very much seems like the proud. And at one point he has sort of human heads on his chariot. We confront this image of him as a very rash, kind of menacing warrior. And yet, in his final moments, when he's subdued, he pleads with Aeneas in the name of his own father, kind of evoking both his identity as a son, but also Aeneas's identity as a son, who's kind of known for this. Exactly. Again, pietas toward his father. So we see there that Virgil is doing these kind of, on some level, there's a slipperiness to it, that characters who look unsympathetic often don't stay unsympathetic for long. And in fact, the character whose side we might expect to be kind of most on makes it very complicated at times for us to side with him.
I like what you said also, because it complicates what we were saying earlier about how this is a poem about a conflict between pietas, which is unemotional and controlled, and all these emotions that are staged as in opposition to pietas. But in fact, very often the poem, especially in the second half, shows us characters who have their own sense of duty, their own sense of honor, their own sense of loyalty to their own homeland, which is being invaded by these new Johnny-come-lately people who've just landed from who knows where. So these ways that it's not just that pietas belongs to the proto-Romans. Pietas belongs to multiple different characters, as do emotions. I know that we are almost running out of the time before you guys should ask a question. You should decide what your question is going to be, because we will wrap up in a minute. But I thought maybe as a last topic, maybe we should talk a little bit about how have you sort of balanced these really difficult interpretative questions in the poem, and how do you see your translation comparing to previous translations, either in formal ways or in the ways that you balance the grief, the pathos, the emotions with the narrative forward drive?
Yes, absolutely. We're glad to speak to that. I think a couple of key priorities for us as translators in approaching this text have been certainly to make room for those emotions to really come to the fore. So often this meant that the two of us would kind of read, intense passages out to one another, and there's a fine line at times between drama and melodrama, so being as careful as we could to push it just far enough, but not too far. We hope. Yeah.
I'm sorry, yeah. I read it in a way that completely melodrama. No. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, you can't. With that passage, it's irresistible with Dido. Yeah, it really is. But that wasn't the most melodramatic version of the draft. So, but I think that's such a central part of Virgil's poetics, that we wanted to be really careful in many ways to make sure that our choices as translators, the tone of the words we used, our diction, metrical features and things like this, that the translation on the one hand felt like poetry. So epic is a category that is at some distance from most of us as readers today. So we didn't want to be kind of unduly casual. For that reason, we avoid things like contractions that kind of catch the ear of the reader as being very colloquial and modern. But we also, there's such an urgency and an immediacy to this poem when you read it in Latin. And I think one of our central goals, and something that we hope we've achieved with this translation, is to bring that immediacy and urgency to life in English for the reader, to enable people to kind of see what Tennyson was describing in Virgil when he addressed him in a poem as "Thou majestic in thy sadness at the doubtful doom of humankind."
Yeah, and I'll just say too about the interpretation of the poem very quickly. We chose not to take a strong interpretive stance one way or the other. That is to say, is this a kind of pro-Roman poem, or is it a more even pessimistic poem about the Roman mission? We tried to keep things as open-ended as we could. We think that reflects what Virgil himself did. So rather than try to kind of impose an interpretive vision on the poem, we try to let it speak for itself, and in that way we think that means keeping things open, keeping things available to the individual reader to respond to the poem as they see fit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would say that probably Dryden didn't think he was imposing British imperialism as a reading on his translation, but he was, right? So it's hard to know exactly what you're doing.
Right.
I mean, consciously in your time. But I completely agree with you that you've really brought out the pathos and the grief of this poem while also bringing out the majesty. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a great
Thank you.
achievement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your work with the world.
Thank you.
So questions, and make sure they're questions, not comments, but we'd love to hear from you. So yes, someone over here.
What do you make of Dido being Phoenician, considering Carthage was an official enemy of Rome? Like how Carthage existed in the Roman imagination at this point after the Punic Wars?
Good. You want to repeat the question? Or?
So the question was, what do we make of Dido being Phoenician, given the wars between Rome and Carthage?
And that's a very good question. Yes, Carthage was, during the Roman Republic, the kind of primary enemy of the Roman people. There were 3 Punic Wars. Wars often come in threes in Roman history. And the Second Punic War is the war with Hannibal, the great famous Carthaginian warrior. It's certainly significant that Dido is Carthaginian. At the end of Book 4, she calls down a curse on the Trojans and her own people and says, may they fight kind of in perpetuity. May a great avenger come, right, to avenge my death. Of course, that's meant to be Hannibal. So I think the fact that Virgil then shows her sympathy, right, shows all the more the extent to which his vision is ecumenical, right? He's able to extend his sympathy even to not just to those who oppose the Trojans, but also to someone who will ultimately be Carthaginian and who will oppose the Romans, right? So it's just a sign of the kind of emotional generosity of this poet, and again, the kind of ambiguities and kind of openness of the poem. It's also the case that she anticipates Cleopatra as well. So, and Cleopatra is another significant thorn in the side, I would say, in the late Republic in the 40s and the 30s too. But again, even there, by showing sympathy to Dido, there's something significant in the openness of that vision.
And also about the ambiguities of Aeneas, right? I mean, the question of, is Aeneas going to be the Hector, or is he going to be the Achilles? Is he going to be the Antony, or is he going to be the Octavian, right? These questions about which moments in history and how do we interpret history in the light of this poem, and then vice versa. He's constantly doing that with history as well as with literature and intertwining the two. Yeah. Over here.
Was there ever a moment where you were like, prior translators just got something wrong?
Did prior translators get stuff wrong?
We'll never say.
You're much too well bred to say, or polite to say any such thing. But what kinds of things did you like less about your colleagues' work?
Is this being recorded?
Okay, you can say no comment if you'd rather. That's fine too. Yes.
I mean, I think one thing we can say is that there were moments that maybe when we felt particular kind of word choices, certain language, there could be choices that we found tonally really jarring, like moments when maybe a particular word kind of pulled us out of the emotional weight of a passage, or it's possible also for that to go both ways, for there to be moments when kind of things read either too colloquially to us or kind of read, too poetically in a potentially artificial sense. So I think a lot of it for us in each case, we really admire so many other translations of the Aeneid, but we also were very conscious of the fact that we were trying to strike a very specific middle ground here, and that at particular moments that might lead us, to sort of quibble with particular choices. Yeah.
And I'll say too, some translators expand the Aeneid quite a bit. So Mandelbaum and Fitzgerald, their books are just longer than Virgil's. Other translators keep line by line, right? So Sarah Rudin does this, a recent translator. Shadi Barch does this as well, right? We also try to strike a middle ground. So I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds here of kind of metrics, but the hexameter line, Virgil's line, is 6 metrical feet. The blank verse line is 5 metrical feet. It also is a short, each foot is shorter, potentially, than a dactylic hexameter line. So That means if you're staying line by line, we felt you're actually kind of shortening the poem, and you're shortening it by a sixth, right? So we decided to strike a middle ground there too. Every 5 lines, we gave ourselves an extra line. That is to say, for each foot that's lost, for each line, you add them up over 5 lines, you give yourself an extra line. So the idea was to give ourselves some constraint, but also to allow ourselves a bit more room than line-by-line translation does.
Lots of questions? Right here.
Hi. You mentioned like various aspects of the poem that are sort of potentially subversive of the Roman project. I was wondering how you thought the sort of poem's original audience would have responded to this. I know it's just speculation, but would they have been a bit surprised, like, oh, he shouldn't be saying this, or would they have sort of nodded in agreement, or a diversity of responses?
Would the poem's original audience have been shocked by the potential for reading the Aeneid as subversive either of Romanitas or of Augustus?
Yeah. We would love to know how Augustus responded to it.
We would love that.
That would be great, right? A story in Virgil's biographical tradition, his ancient biographical tradition, tells us that when Virgil died unexpectedly in 19 BCE, and he called to have the poem burned, right? There are different interpretations as to why he did that, right? But I think the kind of perfectionism argument is probably, to me, the most plausible. But at any rate, and we have no idea if that's historically true. But the other part of that story is that Augustus saved the poem, right? So either he was a bit of a dim-witted reader, right? Or he was more open to varied artistic voices. That's possible too. So anyway, the Augustan response is very, very elusive, but something that's really interesting to think about. In terms of other moments in his reception, I will say in later antiquity, and especially late Christian figures, there's a figure named Lactantius, who's not all that well known, but he really slams Aeneas for his lack of pietas, and especially his lack of pietas at the end of the poem. So that's an interesting kind of glimpse into that counter way of interpreting the poem. So again, we get little glimpses. It's really, we know the poem was canonical from the moment it was published. We know it was a school text. We know it became the great Roman epic poem to match Homer's poetry as of 19 BCE. But individual responses are a bit more difficult to grasp. Right? Yeah.
Over here. Yes.
I appreciate listening to your translations of the dialogues, and I'm curious how you thought about giving characters voices, especially given that you had the advantage of being 2 translators here. Did either you take on a particular character and take charge of their voice?
So the question is about giving characters different voices and whether you broke that up by character. Was one of you always writing the Aeneas lines?
So it was not the case that one of us was always writing the Aeneas lines. And I think as much as we could, we both tried to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of all of these characters. It can be the case when translating epic and when translating something that's very far removed from our present day context. There's a risk of kind of flattening it all out and having it sound like this sort of monolithic kind of epic voice. The Aeneid doesn't read like that in Latin. We didn't think it should read that way in English either. So there are moments, I'm thinking in particular of, there's a sort of dramatic kind of war of words in Book 11 of the poem where we have Turnus and a kind of slightly slimy advisor among the Italians really going after one another and having this kind of verbal sparring match. Scenes like that sometimes were very challenging, but I would say most of all it was an exercise of kind of reading aloud each of us kind of bits and pieces. We didn't necessarily kind of act it out like a play where one of us would read, Dido and one of us would read Aeneas or something like that. But to make sure that those voices rang true, we really, really had to hear them. And also revisit them countless times. Like, do we really think that Aeneas would use this word right here? I'm not sure he would. So it was a lot of kind of microscopic, choices that all kind of come together to create this characterization.
Over here. Yes, you. Yes.
So I know you spoke about how Dryden imposed British colonialism on his translation of the text, and you've said that you wanted to find a middle ground in the text. But without that constraint, how do you think your identities and your cultural experience and life experience would have affected your translation of the text?
How might your life experience have affected your translation? Life experiences. Presumably you've had different lives.
We have, yes.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. It can be difficult to kind of reflect on that, I think, because I think a lot of this can be unconscious. But I will say that I'm the older of the two of us, and this time because I'm a classicist, I've read this poem many, many times, and this time, Aeneas, I think, reading it so closely, Aeneas, I think, kind of spoke to me a bit more than he has in the past, and I think I felt a bit more sympathy with him. Now, anyone can feel that way, right? This is not bound to any one identity, but I do think the more kind of life experience you get, potentially, the more his kind of weariness, but also his sense that of just kind of moving forward, regardless of what's around you, and just trying to put one step in front of the other. It's at least more resonant, right? I mean, I don't know if that manifested itself in any way in the translation, but I think in the process of interpreting the poem, which of course translators do every single line, almost every single word, I really kind of felt that.
Do you want to add about your life in some way?
I am tempted to add, but I know we have loads of other wonderful questions, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. Yeah, I mean, I think certainly those differences in terms of kind of life stage actually were and many times kind of fun for us to work through. That because we were approaching this poem from different perspectives in terms of age and gender and kind of life stage and all manner of things. I think it was a kind of fun challenge, actually, to set ourselves the task of, on some level, trying to see how far we could get out of the way of what Virgil was trying to do. Obviously, no translator can kind of completely efface their own kind of mediating role between the original text and the translation that is produced. But I think as collaborators, kind of negotiating those moments was really critical in recognizing that we brought kind of different experiences and identities to the table.
Thank you. There's lots of questions. I'm going to take one from over here. Yes.
Hi. I'm wondering if you have any lines that stick out to you as being particularly difficult to translate.
What lines were extra difficult? They were all presumably very difficult, but tell us one very difficult line. Maybe you can do one each.
Okay.
I think one that occurs to me as having been a particular challenge was there's a metaphor that is used in one of the kind of battle scenes late in the poem, where kind of an adversary is described as being a sort of a nodum, a knot, kind of battle. And trying to figure out metaphors as a category are notoriously difficult. It seems like that one carries with it a sense of actually being perhaps like a knot in wood that slows down a blade as you try to cut through it. That line went through so many iterations. Most all of them were terrible. I think we wound up settling on describing this figure as something like a knot in battle slowing down the blade, just spelling it out slightly more for the reader, because all the Latin really says is that he is a knot and delay of battle. And you can't really, in English, it felt like that was something we couldn't put our readers through and expect them to kind of understand at all what we meant. But I remember that one, we came back to that one so many times.
She took my example. That was my example.
But Virgil's concision is one of the big challenges, and obviously there's challenges about how do you convey that resonant concision while not adding too much, while actually keeping that resonant ambiguity of you've actually got to do some work here in this poem. It's not necessarily an entirely easy reading experience, but there's a beauty in the things left unsaid, and there are lacrimae rerum and all of those things. Yes, in the front.
So my question could probably be, the answer could probably be like a whole book or research paper. But I was interested in comparison to the Iliad and the Odyssey, how much of it was interpreted as actual historic fact versus how much of it was interpreted as literary fiction during the time.
So as I understand the question, we've set it up that Virgil is making poetic and literary allusions to Homer, Apollonius, earlier Roman epic, tragedy, many other earlier literature, and also, on the other hand, to Roman history. But the questioner is asking, was Homer imagined to be history too? Was there a real Trojan War? One Trojan War in which Achilles fought.
And the answer is, of course, we don't know. Now we do know there was a historical site of Troy, and archaeological evidence tells us there was a great war there. These.
It's less if it actually happened and more did people believe it happened.
Yeah. Many historians treated it as history. So they were writing works of history and incorporating the Trojan War and the Trojan War stories into their histories. There's a contemporary historian of Virgil named Livy, and he's a little uncertain, right? He says, well, the stuff before the kind of Republic, we don't really know if it's history or myth. And we'll kind of leave that open, right? And if any nation deserves to have a mythic history, it's Rome anyway, right? So, so he tries to have it both ways. But there were certainly historians who did treat it as history, right? Without question, and going back to the Greek tradition as well. So, and yeah, I'll leave it there if you want to.
Yeah. I would say in terms of the Greek tradition, a very good example of that is Herodotus, who takes the Trojan War seriously as an event that was actually kind of the prequel to the Persian Wars that are the focus of his history. So he sort of sets it up by saying there's this series of reciprocal abductions, including the abduction of Helen that kicked off the Trojan War, that are all kind of part of the backstory of this mythic past. But it's also that the historicity of the Trojan War is something that was really being kind of hotly debated and played with over centuries. So we get everything from including it, pretty seriously in historiography, to kind of tongue-in-cheek, responses that say things like, well, men of Troy, let me tell you the truth. You actually won the Trojan War. It wasn't the Greeks the whole time. So there's room for kind of play and parody as well in terms of this tradition.
I'll say it just so happens Susannah's teaching a course this semester on the Trojan War and the kind of various histories of the Trojan War. So I think you could speak for a while on that.
I'll spare you that, though.
Over here.
You mentioned that the Aeneid was sort of literary canon the moment that it came out. Can you talk about, in a more general form, the conditions for canonization of the literary work, and perhaps give a reflection on whether those conditions apply today? This has been something that's been disputed throughout history.
Sure. Yeah.
So how did the Aeneid become canonical and remain canonical until a generation ago? And what were the conditions of canonicity? And are they the same today now that we have book talk?
Right.
As it happens, Scott has taught a class on that.
Right, exactly. So I'll say, first of all, that even before the Aeneid was complete, there was a process of canonizing it. So there's a contemporary poet named Propertius who says, something greater than the Iliad is being born, right? And this is, again, before it's published, right? So it's kind of always already a kind of canonical poem. But a major force in canonizing the poem is the schools, right? So immediately the Aeneid became a school text. That meant that anyone who was educated in the Roman world, right? And Rome was a very kind of traditionalist, kind of conservative place, so the curriculum stayed in place until at least 500, right? So it's the same curriculum that students are being taught, and the Aeneid is at the center of that curriculum. So every generation, right, you have a new generation of young readers learning about this poem. And from what we can tell, the grammarians like to emphasize the greatness of the poem, right? So it wasn't a kind of neutral process of learning that poem. So there's that, and I'll say too, we have Ovid's Metamorphoses is the kind of next kind of great epic poem in the Roman tradition, and that's completed in 8 CE, so 27 years after Virgil's death and the publication of the Aeneid. And we know there, Ovid views the Aeneid as casting a very long shadow, right? So there's in a sense, he has to kind of finesse his way kind of around this great canonical poem. So there too, even his kind of literary successors are also, in a sense, kind of constructing that canonicity, or at least responding to that canonicity, and therefore kind of perpetuating it.
More questions? Right over here. with the white hat.
So, Scott, you said you would not cast Brad Pitt.
No.
But for your movie adaptation, I'm kind of curious, for each of you, who you cast as Aeneas and who you cast as Dido.
So what's your casting? Who's Aeneas? Who's Dido? You can also put in bids for Turnus and Camilla and Venus and whoever else you want. Yes.
I have to say, this is a question about which we have not thought at all.
Okay. You can say no
Ever.
comment and come back at the end. That's fine, it's fine too.
Maybe we'll
Think
open it
about
up.
Yes.
To the, right?
Does
Yeah.
anyone have good ideas? Does anyone feel like they have an Aeneas in mind? He's a hard character to cast. Yeah, because he's so... What'd you say?
Ray Fiennes.
Ray Fiennes.
Right,
Ray
Ray
Fiennes.
Fiennes, who was just
Yes.
in an
He's-
Odyssey.
He's too old right now, but he would have been great.
He
Yes,
would have been
that's
great.
the right answer.
He would have been great.
Yes.
It's a
Yeah.
really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, over here.
This is
Yes.
well. I guess for the casting, I'm thinking DiCaprio a la One Battle After Another for Aeneas. But I'm wondering how your background as classicists is coming into play in this translation, especially since so many times when a poem is co-translated, you'll have one person who specializes more in the scholarly area and one person who specializes more in the poetic area. So I'm wondering, how does your experience with the text in the past, your experience teaching the text and interacting with students, and perhaps experience with scholarship and commentary come into the translation process? And how does that maybe conflict with the more poetic concerns?
How do you balance your awareness of how the poem teaches, your experience of teaching this poem, your awareness of the bibliography, and your desires to make it live as poetry?
I would say those are concerns that we were really kind of balancing the whole way through. As people who both have spent a lot of time kind of reading and thinking with this text over the years, but then also teaching it, you kind of, there's when you come to any given passage, right, you're sort of encountering it not only that one time, but there's a sort of shadow of all of the other times that you've looked at it in the past. I think for us, certainly thinking about passages in the classroom that confused our students or that maybe resonated more clearly to us in the Latin and kind of perhaps hadn't come through, those were moments where we wanted to kind of spend some extra time making sure that we were, as much as we could, kind of sticking the landing in bringing those over into English. I think, though, I should say also that in addition to being classicists professionally, both of us are also just passionate appreciators of the tradition of English verse. And so we tried, insofar as we could, to kind of do justice to that as well, in our attention to diction and also in our attention to things like Virgil's sound effects. We wanted to really honor the poetic side of Virgil's project as much as we could too.
Yeah, and I'll say very quickly that there's a robust commentary tradition around Virgil, and this is what classicists do. They go line by line, and they explicate the poem line by line, right? So we were always consulting those as well, and where they can be helpful is in really trying to parse out the subtleties of meaning in the poem, and then for us trying to find the appropriate word in English to correspond to that. Yeah.
Other questions?
I think here.
Oh, sorry, I can't see. Yes,
Very
over here,
patient.
over here.
Yes.
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 What are some of the challenges and glories that you had while trying to translate all the battle scenes from Latin into English? Partly because you had to collect all the emotions of it, like all the excitement you get from watching or reading battle scenes, especially for Virgil, who read Homer pretty closely, and try to put it into Latin, and also making it into good English poetry that read thrillingly, but also you could admire the poetry, but also feel all the sadness, even in a context that had a very alien view of what battle was looked like compared to us, and all that entailed, to try to keep it in a concise question.
What kinds of challenges were there in battle scenes representing violence from the poem?
A lot of them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I would say for both of us, having fortunately never had the experience of being on a Virgilian battlefield, right, there were a lot of aspects that we struggled with. How do you capture the suspense, but also the precision? Because epic poetry is often very, very specific about the descriptions that it gives to particular characters' deaths. I think one of our major priorities was trying to make sure that the pace felt like that we preserved kind of a sense of motion and momentum. It's important that some characters get kind of a bit part in a short death, and that other scenes are kind of, Yes, yeah, exactly. How big is the death? But I think also, Emily, with your experience with the Iliad, I'd be interested to hear if how you approached similar concerns
Right,
too.
I mean, none
Yeah.
of us are combat veterans, but
Right,
all of us
right.
have written a lot of very intense battle scenes. I mean, I think the question is really getting to something that I also have found very, very challenging about how do you make sure you convey the energy and the excitement and the aliveness and the sort of presence of the dead as well as the living on the battlefield, and the way that there are all these challenges about how do you not import sort of modern terminology about trauma and aggression into these sequences, where the whole ways that the poem is thinking about violence are actually quite different from modern ways of thinking about violence. Yeah. We should probably let at least one last person ask the question. Yes.
I guess that speaks to my question, which is how close do you think you can get to the psyche of Virgil or of a Roman reading, spending time with this poem or reading it?
So does the Aeneid serve as a time machine where we can get, or even more than a machine, you just immerse yourself inside the mind of Virgil by reading the Aeneid? Is that possible?
Yeah. I mean, with translation, you want to have this kind of medium kind of feeling where you do want to, as much as possible, kind of feel what the poet might have felt, or at least kind of face the poetry in similar ways to how Virgil himself did. I mean, I think that kind of sympathy, right? You need to try to create this sympathy with this figure who's, of course, entirely lost to you, right? And again, chronologically, that's the case. We don't really know much firm about his biography at all, right? But we do know the kind of authorial character he was. We know the kind of authorial voice he had. We don't know Virgil might have been a surly, inarticulate, like truculent dude, right? When he wasn't writing poetry, right? But when he wrote poetry, he was this incredibly sensitive, right? Vivid, kind of wonderful, kind of emotional poet. So you try to get to that figure at least, and try to feel as much as you can what that figure was experiencing.
And I would say the beauty of reading ancient literature in general, of translating it, but also of coming to it as a reader, is that we encounter at once these texts that are very far removed from us in terms of space and time, right? We're coming to them across these great gulfs. But then at the same time, there are these moments when there's this sort of collapsing of that distance, and you feel kind of like you're there, or kind of like you get it. And there are moments when, as translators, we felt that, when we felt perhaps that, especially in the discipline of kind of chipping away at this long poem over the course of years, that maybe we had something in common with the experience of Virgil, who similarly chipped away at it over many, many years. There were also moments when we felt very distant from him as a poet, and I think that strikes me as something that's true to the experience of reading a poem like this as well. But there's so much worth in trying to sort of peer across that distance, and we hope that our readers, in the translation, will find at least something of a bridge that can maybe.
I think you've achieved an amazing, more than a bridge, but I'm not going to say it's exactly a time machine, but it really does transport you to something like the experience of reading the Latin. I've been told that was the last question, so we're just going to congratulate these translators one last time. Thank you so much.